Welcome to Unrecorded Histories, your source for untold secrets, lost stories, and shocking facts. Subscribe now. Imagine a young boy born into one of America's wealthiest families. A boy destined for greatness, but also for tragedy. That boy would grow up to be John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States. But before the bright lights of the White House, before the Cold War standoffs, and before that fateful day in Dallas, there was a life shaped by privilege, struggle, and determination. Today, we uncover the complete story of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, from his birth, family roots, education, political rise, and ultimately, the shocking assassination that changed America forever. Stay with us until the end. Share, like, and subscribe to Unrecorded Histories channel, because what you're about to hear is not just history, it's the untold journey of the man America called JFK. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born on May 29, 1917, in Brookline, Massachusetts. His arrival came at a time when America was on the brink of entering World War I. The world was unstable, but inside the Kennedy household, there was stability and enormous ambition. He was the second son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. and Rose Elizabeth Fitzgerald Kennedy. His parents were not ordinary Americans. Joseph Kennedy Sr. was a wealthy businessman and investor with deep political ambitions. He served as the first chairman of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission and later as U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, the daughter of Boston Mayor John Honeyfitz Fitzgerald, came from a powerful political dynasty herself. From the very beginning, John was destined to live under the weight of two families that demanded greatness. The Kennedys were Irish Catholic, at a time when Irish immigrants still faced prejudice in America. Joseph Kennedy Sr., determined to rise above this, poured his energy into business, politics, and shaping his children into future leaders. John's childhood was marked by privilege, but also illness. He was a frail child, constantly battling health problems. Scarlet fever nearly killed him when he was young, yet his parents never allowed weakness to define him. The Kennedy household was competitive, with 9 children in total. Each was pushed to succeed. In particular, Joseph Kennedy Sr. set his eyes on his eldest son, Joseph Kennedy Jr., grooming him for future leadership. John, nicknamed Jack, was seen as the quieter, sickly brother. Few could have predicted that it would be Jack, not Joe Jr., who would become president. John F. Kennedy, or Jack as his family called him, may have been born into wealth, but his early academic journey was anything but easy. His childhood was plagued with sickness. He suffered from chronic back problems, mysterious fevers, digestive disorders, and what doctors would later identify as Addison's disease, a condition that weakened his immune system. Despite his fragile health, Jack's parents insisted he be educated among America's elite. They believed discipline, competition, and education would forge greatness. At age 13, Jack enrolled at Choate, an exclusive boarding school in Connecticut. His father had high hopes, but Jack was far from the model student. He was mischievous and witty, often playing pranks with his friends, a group nicknamed the Muckers Club. Teachers described him as careless and unserious. His grades were average, but his sharp mind stood out whenever he applied himself. Behind his playful nature, Jack developed a love for reading history, politics, and international affairs. He was fascinated by Winston Churchill, European leaders, and the rise of fascism in the 1930s. At Choate, Jack also began to understand something crucial about leadership. Charisma mattered as much as intelligence. He wasn't the top student, but classmates admired his charm, humor, and ability to inspire loyalty. In 1936, Jack followed in his father's footsteps and entered Harvard University. By then, the Kennedy family's ambitions were clear. The eldest son, Joe Jr., was being groomed for politics, while Jack was still seen as the quieter backup. At Harvard, Jack's academic focus sharpened. He majored in government and international relations. His studies coincided with the rise of Adolf Hitler in Germany and growing global tension. Jack became obsessed with foreign policy, reading about dictatorships, democracy, and war strategy. But Jack wasn't just about books. At Harvard, he joined the swimming team and the sailing club. He was known for his playboy lifestyle, dating numerous women, enjoying parties, and building a reputation as a ladies' man. His health continued to challenge him. He was often hospitalized, at times nearly dying from infections and severe back pain. Yet despite his illnesses, Jack displayed a resilience that impressed his peers. He never complained openly, and he masked his pain with wit and charm. In 1937, while still at Harvard, Jack traveled abroad. His father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., had been appointed U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom, giving Jack a front-row seat to international politics. He studied for a short time at the London School of Economics, absorbing lessons from Europe's leading thinkers. More importantly, he witnessed firsthand the rise of Nazi Germany and the appeasement policies of British leaders. This experience deeply shaped his worldview. Back at Harvard, Jack began work on his senior thesis. His topic, Why Britain Was So Unprepared for World War II. His paper, titled Appeasement in Munich, argued that Britain's leaders had failed to confront Hitler early, leading to disaster. The thesis impressed his professors so much that it was published as a book in 1940. The book, titled Why England Slept, became a bestseller. For a 23-year-old, this was extraordinary. It marked the beginning of Jack's reputation as a serious thinker on foreign policy. John F. Kennedy graduated from Harvard in 1940. By then, war had engulfed Europe. His father, Ambassador Joseph Kennedy Sr., was criticized for being too sympathetic to appeasement policies, but Jack emerged as an independent thinker. He had proven himself more than just a wealthy playboy. He was a scholar with insights into world affairs. Yet at this point, few still believed he would surpass his older brother, Joe Jr., in leadership. But fate had other plans. While Jack Kennedy's academic journey shaped his mind, it was his service in World War II that would shape his courage, his leadership, and his destiny. In the crucible of war, Jack transformed from a privileged young man into a national hero. When John F. Kennedy graduated from Harvard in 1940, the world was at war. Nazi Germany had swept across Europe, and the United States was inching closer to involvement. For Jack, service was both a duty and a chance to prove himself beyond the shadow of his older brother Joe Jr., who was seen as the Kennedy destined for greatness. Despite his chronic health issues, Jack pushed hard to join the U.S. military. Initially, Jack was rejected by the U.S. Army due to his recurring back problems and history of illness. Many men would have accepted this fate, but Jack Kennedy refused. With the help of family connections and his own determination, he applied to the U.S. Navy. In 1941, after a strenuous medical review, Jack was accepted and commissioned as an ensign in the Naval Reserve. He underwent officer training and later requested assignment to active duty. His health may have been fragile, but his willpower was iron. By 1943, Jack was serving in the Pacific Theater, where some of the fiercest battles of World War II were fought. He was given command of a small patrol torpedo boat, the PT-109. The PT boats were fast, lightly armed vessels designed to harass Japanese shipping and defend U.S. forces. Life aboard was dangerous. The crew faced enemy gunfire, brutal weather, and the constant risk of death. Despite his youth, Lieutenant John F. Kennedy quickly earned the respect of his men. He was calm under pressure, known for his humor, which boosted morale, hands-on, often working alongside his crew instead of simply commanding from above. Everything changed on the night of August 2nd, 1943. While patrolling near the Solomon Islands, PT-109 was suddenly struck by the Japanese destroyer Amagiri. The collision was catastrophic. The destroyer sliced PT-109 in half, killing 2 crew members instantly. The surviving 11 men, including Jack, were thrown into the burning, oil-soaked water. Amid chaos, flames, and darkness, Jack Kennedy emerged as a leader. Despite his own severe back injuries, he rallied the survivors. He swam from man to man, ensuring they were alive. He towed an injured sailor, Patrick McMahon, for miles through rough seas, gripping the man's life jacket strap with his teeth. He led his men to a small deserted island, exhausted but alive. Stranded behind enemy lines, the crew survived on coconuts and rainwater. Jack did not rest. He made repeated swims, sometimes several miles at a time, searching for passing Allied boats and safe islands. At one point, he carved a message into a coconut shell. This coconut was delivered by friendly islanders to U.S. forces. Soon after, PT-109's surviving crew was rescued. For his actions, John F. Kennedy received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism and the Purple Heart for his injuries. His outstanding courage, endurance, and leadership contributed to the saving of his crew and were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The story of PT-109 spread quickly. Newspapers across the U.S. hailed the young officer as a war hero. For the Kennedys, this moment was pivotal. Jack had not only survived but had earned something far greater: national recognition. When the war ended in 1945, Jack was medically discharged from the Navy. His health was worse than ever. His back pain was nearly unbearable, and he would undergo multiple surgeries in the coming years. But his spirit was unbroken. Jack Kennedy had gained the admiration of his peers, the respect of his crew, and most importantly, the reputation of a man of courage and sacrifice. This would later become the foundation of his political career. When he ran for office, his campaign posters proudly displayed the phrase, "The hero of PT-109." John F. Kennedy entered the war as a privileged young man. He left it as a national hero. The bravery and resilience he showed in the Pacific laid the groundwork for the next chapter of his life: politics. But destiny would take a sharp turn when tragedy struck the Kennedy family, reshaping his future forever. When World War II ended in 1945, John F. Kennedy returned to civilian life a decorated hero. But his war injuries left him with chronic pain. At times, he struggled to even walk without a brace. Despite this, the fire for public service was burning inside him. The Kennedy family had always been political. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., had once been U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom and remained influential in Democratic Party circles. His older brother, Joe Jr., had been groomed for politics, but his tragic death in 1944 during a dangerous bombing mission left a void. Now all eyes turned to Jack. In 1946, the Democratic Party needed a candidate for Massachusetts' 11th congressional district. With his war hero image, Kennedy was the perfect choice. At just 29 years old, Jack announced his candidacy for the U.S. House of Representatives. His campaign slogan, "The new generation offers a leader." Kennedy's team, heavily supported by his father's money and influence, worked tirelessly. Campaign workers distributed pamphlets, knocked on doors, and reminded voters of his PT-109 heroism. Jack himself went door to door, shaking hands and listening to the concerns of working-class families. His charm and charisma were undeniable. Despite being relatively unknown, he defeated his opponents with ease. On January 3, 1947, John F. Kennedy was sworn into the U.S. House of Representatives. He was only 29, one of the youngest members at the time. During his 6 years in the House, JFK advocated for better housing for veterans, supported labor rights but remained cautious about radical policies, criticized communism, and strongly opposed Soviet influence abroad. This period was during the early Cold War, and Kennedy's anti-communist stance helped him appeal to both Democrats and Republicans. However, Jack also earned a reputation for being independent-minded. He didn't always follow party lines, preferring to study issues carefully before taking a stand. His colleagues admired his intelligence, even if he sometimes seemed distant due to frequent hospital visits. By the early 1950s, JFK had his sights set higher. The Senate seat for Massachusetts, held by Republican Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., was up for re-election in 1952. This was no easy race. Lodge was popular and respected, but the Kennedys ran one of the most organized, well-financed campaigns Massachusetts had ever seen. Kennedy's team flooded neighborhoods with campaign material. His mother, Rose Kennedy, and sisters personally visited voters. His father invested heavily in advertising, and Jack, despite his pain, campaigned tirelessly. His slogan this time, "Kennedy will do more for Massachusetts." The timing was crucial. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower was sweeping the country in the presidential election. But in Massachusetts, Jack Kennedy pulled off an upset victory, defeating Lodge. At just 35 years old, John F. Kennedy became a U.S. Senator. As a senator, Kennedy gained national attention. He focused on key issues. Foreign policy, he consistently warned about the dangers of Soviet expansion. Labor issues. He supported unions, but pushed for moderation. Civil rights. Though cautious at first, Kennedy began supporting racial equality more strongly over time. But the Senate years were not easy. Kennedy's health deteriorated. He underwent 2 risky back surgeries, one of which nearly killed him. While recovering, he began writing. During his long hospital stays, JFK worked on a book that examined U.S. senators who had risked their careers for principle over politics. In 1956, the book, Profiles in Courage, was published. It became a bestseller and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1957. This achievement elevated Kennedy's reputation beyond Massachusetts. He was now seen not only as a young senator, but as a serious intellectual and leader. In 1956, Kennedy nearly leaped into the national spotlight as a vice presidential candidate. At the Democratic National Convention, he was considered for the vice president slot alongside Adlai Stevenson. He campaigned hard for the position and came very close, but ultimately lost to Senator Estes Kefauver. This defeat turned out to be a blessing. It gave JFK national exposure without tying him to Stevenson's losing ticket. By 1957, political insiders were already whispering, John F. Kennedy could be the future of the Democratic Party. In 1953, Kennedy married Jacqueline Bouvier, a sophisticated journalist and photographer. Jackie brought elegance, charm, and a cosmopolitan flair to Jack's public image. Together, they became one of America's most admired couples, young, glamorous, and intelligent. Their marriage became central to the Kennedy brand, appealing to voters across the country. By the late 1950s, Kennedy was carefully positioning himself for the ultimate prize, the White House. He built strong relationships with journalists, ensuring favorable press coverage. His family, especially his father, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to secure support. He traveled across the country, giving speeches and winning over Democratic leaders. In 1958, Kennedy was re-elected to the Senate in a landslide, winning nearly 75% of the vote in Massachusetts. This overwhelming victory sent a clear signal. John F. Kennedy was no longer just a senator. He was a national figure ready for higher office. By 1960, JFK stood on the edge of destiny. The stage was set for a presidential campaign that would make history. But the road ahead was anything but easy. America was divided, the Cold War was heating up, and doubts about his youth and Catholic faith loomed large. Yet Kennedy's courage, charisma, and vision would soon carry him to the highest office in the land. Hit the like and subscribe button as we continue. And don't forget to share to a friend as to gain deep insight on the life of our dear leader and legend, John F. Kennedy. By the late 1950s, John F. Kennedy was no longer just a Massachusetts senator. He was a national star, young, eloquent, and charismatic. But there was one more mountain to climb, the presidency of the United States. In January 1960, Kennedy officially announced his candidacy for president. He was only 42 years old, younger than most of his rivals. Critics claimed he was inexperienced and too young for the White House. Even more controversial was his Catholic faith. No Catholic had ever been elected president. Many Americans worried that a Catholic president would take orders from the Pope in Rome rather than act independently. Kennedy knew this was his biggest obstacle, yet he believed America was ready for a new kind of leader, one who represented a new generation of politics. The first test came in the Democratic primaries. His main rival was Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, a respected liberal with strong support from labor unions. Kennedy chose to challenge Humphrey directly in 2 key states, Wisconsin, April 1960, West Virginia, May 1960. In Wisconsin, Kennedy won narrowly. Critics argued he had carried the state only because of Catholic voters. So the true test came in West Virginia, where Catholics were a tiny minority. Kennedy campaigned relentlessly, meeting coal miners, their families, and union workers. He spoke about poverty, unemployment, and America's future. He connected personally with voters, shaking hands in coal dust-covered towns, sitting in diners, and listening to ordinary people's struggles. In May 1960, Kennedy won West Virginia in a landslide, silencing critics. He had proven he could win in a Protestant-dominated state. At the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles, Kennedy faced competition from Lyndon B. Johnson, the powerful Senate Majority Leader from Texas, and Adlai Stevenson, the party's nominee in 1952 and 1956. But Kennedy's campaign organization, funded and orchestrated by his father, brothers, and loyal team, was unmatched. On July 13, 1960, John F. Kennedy secured the Democratic nomination for president. In his acceptance speech, he called on Americans to embrace a new vision. Kennedy described the new frontier as a call to action, tackling poverty, advancing science, protecting freedom, and exploring the unknown, including space. It was bold, it was inspiring, and it set him apart from his rivals. Kennedy made a surprising choice for vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. At first, many were shocked. Kennedy and Johnson were not close allies. In fact, they had been rivals. But Kennedy knew he needed Johnson, a Texan, to balance the ticket and win over Southern voters. This strategic decision proved vital in what would become one of the closest elections in American history. Kennedy's opponent was Richard Nixon, the sitting vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower. Nixon was experienced, tough on communism, and well-known across the country. Many believed he was the favorite to win, but Kennedy had one advantage: charisma. Where Nixon was formal and stiff, Kennedy was charming and confident. The 1960 campaign made history with the first ever televised presidential debates. 4 debates were scheduled, and they would change American politics forever. On September 26, 1960, nearly 70 million Americans tuned in to watch Kennedy and Nixon face off. Nixon, recovering from illness, appeared pale and tired. He refused makeup, and under the hot studio lights, he sweated visibly. Kennedy, tanned, confident, and calm, looked straight into the camera, speaking directly to the American people. Those who listened on the radio thought Nixon had won on points, but television viewers overwhelmingly believed Kennedy had dominated. This single debate transformed Kennedy from a young senator into a presidential figure. The debates became a turning point in the election, proving the growing power of television and media in shaping politics. Kennedy's campaign was relentless. He traveled to nearly every state, shaking hands, giving speeches, and connecting with ordinary citizens. His campaign slogan captured the spirit of his movement. Jackie Kennedy, though pregnant at the time, also played a vital role. She charmed audiences in Spanish-language broadcasts, appealing to Hispanic voters, particularly in Texas and the Southwest. The Kennedy family, especially brothers Bobby and Ted, were constantly on the campaign trail, giving the campaign an energetic, youthful image. One of Kennedy's defining moments came on September 12, 1960, when he addressed a group of Protestant ministers in Houston, Texas. He declared firmly, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I am the Democratic Party's candidate for president, who happens also to be a Catholic." He promised that no religious leader, not even the Pope, would dictate his policies. His speech reassured millions of skeptical voters and is still considered a landmark in the history of American religious freedom. November 8, 1960. The election was one of the closest in American history. Kennedy won 49.7% of the popular vote, compared to Nixon's 49.5%. In the Electoral College, Kennedy secured 303 votes, while Nixon had 219. It was razor thin, but it was enough. At just 43 years old, John F. Kennedy became the youngest elected president in U.S. history and the first Catholic to hold the office. January 20th, 1961. On a cold January day in Washington, Kennedy delivered one of the most famous inaugural addresses in history. With snow still covering the ground, he inspired Americans with these immortal words: "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." It was the dawn of a new era, the Kennedy era, often remembered as Camelot. Kennedy had achieved what many thought impossible, but winning the White House was only the beginning. Ahead lay enormous challenges: the Cold War, civil rights, space exploration, and finally the tragedy that would cut his story short. John F. Kennedy's presidency began on January 20th, 1961, with the youngest elected president in U.S. history delivering one of the most inspiring inaugural addresses ever. Americans felt a new sense of optimism. The Kennedy years would soon be called Camelot, a golden age of hope, youth, and energy. But behind the glamour, Kennedy faced immense challenges: the Cold War, racial injustice, poverty, and a nation at the crossroads of history. Kennedy's domestic agenda was called the New Frontier. It wasn't just a slogan, it was a promise to push America into a new era. Key goals of the New Frontier included expanding civil rights protections, boosting economic growth and creating jobs, advancing space exploration, improving education and healthcare. Kennedy believed that America could lead the world not just with weapons, but with ideas, science, and justice. From the start, Kennedy's presidency was defined by the Cold War. The Soviet Union was America's main rival, and the threat of nuclear war hung over the world. Just 3 months into his presidency, Kennedy approved a secret plan, inherited from President Eisenhower, to overthrow Cuba's communist leader, Fidel Castro. The plan involved Cuban exiles invading Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, but the invasion quickly collapsed. Castro's forces crushed the rebels, and Kennedy was humiliated on the world stage. Despite the disaster, Kennedy took full responsibility, earning respect from the American people. But it also made him determined never to be misled by military advisors again. That same year, tensions rose in Germany. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev threatened to cut off Western access to West Berlin. Kennedy responded firmly, declaring America's commitment to defending Berlin. In August 1961, the Soviets built the Berlin Wall, dividing East and West Berlin. Kennedy visited Berlin 2 years later, giving his famous speech, "Ich bin ein Berliner," I am a Berliner. It was a powerful declaration of solidarity with the people of West Berlin, strengthening America's moral leadership in the Cold War. Kennedy's greatest test came in October 1962. U.S. intelligence discovered Soviet nuclear missiles being installed in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. For 13 tense days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Many believed this could be the end of humanity. Kennedy chose a middle path. Instead of bombing Cuba, he ordered a naval blockade around the island to stop Soviet ships from delivering more weapons. After intense negotiations, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade Cuba. Secretly, Kennedy also agreed to remove American missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended peacefully, and Kennedy was hailed for his steady leadership. He had faced down nuclear Armageddon and pulled the world back from the edge. Kennedy believed space exploration was key to America's future. In May 1961, he made a bold promise before Congress. "I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." This inspired the Apollo program. Though Kennedy would not live to see it, his vision was fulfilled in 1969 when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. This moment remains one of the greatest achievements in human history, and it was Kennedy's leadership that made it possible. Kennedy's presidency coincided with the rise of the civil rights movement. In 1961, African-American students known as the Freedom Riders challenged segregation in the South. Kennedy sent federal marshals to protect them. In 1962, he ordered federal troops to escort James Meredith, the first black student to enroll at the University of Mississippi. In 1963, Kennedy gave a historic speech calling civil rights a moral issue, urging Congress to pass legislation ending segregation. This set the stage for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which would be signed into law after his death. Though progress was slow, Kennedy gave the movement presidential support at a critical time. Kennedy worked to improve American life at home. He raised the minimum wage, expanded Social Security benefits, increased federal funding for education, invested in public housing and urban renewal. Though many of his programs were blocked by Congress, his presidency laid the foundation for future reforms. Kennedy also sought to inspire hope abroad. He created the Peace Corps in 1961, sending young Americans overseas to help with education, healthcare, and development. The Peace Corps became one of his most enduring legacies. He supported independence movements in Africa, meeting leaders like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana. He promoted nuclear arms control, signing the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963 with the Soviet Union and the UK, the first major step toward nuclear disarmament. Part of what made Kennedy so beloved was not just his policies, but his style and charisma. He held lively press conferences broadcast on television, speaking with wit and intelligence. His wife, Jacqueline Kennedy, brought elegance and cultural sophistication to the White House. She restored historic rooms and made the presidency glamorous. Together, the Kennedys became symbols of youth, energy, and hope, a modern American royal family. The media dubbed their time in power Camelot, after the legendary kingdom of King Arthur. Despite his popularity, Kennedy made powerful enemies. Segregationists in the South despised his support for civil rights. The CIA and military distrusted him after the Bay of Pigs and his refusal to invade Cuba during the missile crisis. Big business leaders opposed his push for tax reform. Some within his own party doubted his ability to win a second term. The political atmosphere was becoming tense, and Kennedy himself sensed danger. In late 1963, Kennedy began preparing for his re-election campaign. He traveled across the country, promoting his accomplishments and rallying support. On November 22, 1963, he arrived in Dallas, Texas, for a campaign trip. Crowds cheered as his motorcade passed through the streets. No one could have imagined what would happen next. A sunny Friday in Dallas, Texas. Thousands of Americans lined the streets, cheering as President John F. Kennedy's motorcade slowly passed through Dealey Plaza. Just moments later, gunshots rang out. The president slumped forward, mortally wounded. Within minutes, the leader of the free world was gone. For decades, we have been told one version of events, that a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, ended JFK's life. But millions of Americans have never believed that story. President Kennedy was more than a politician. He was a symbol of hope, young, charismatic, and determined to push America forward. On that November day in 1963, his trip to Dallas was meant to calm political tensions in Texas. As the motorcade moved through Dealey Plaza, Jacqueline Kennedy sat gracefully beside him. Texas Governor John Connally rode in the front seat. Crowds cheered, waving American flags and snapping photographs. Then, at 12:30 p.m., it happened. The sound of gunfire cracked through the air. Kennedy was struck. Chaos erupted. People screamed and ducked for cover. Governor Connally was also hit. The limousine rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but within half an hour, doctors pronounced John F. Kennedy dead. America's young president, gone at just 46 years old. Newscaster Walter Cronkite's emotional announcement that day remains etched in memory. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. For many Americans, it was the day the nation lost its innocence. The government acted quickly. Within hours, police arrested a man, Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who had lived in the Soviet Union. Authorities claimed Oswald fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. 2 days later, before Oswald could stand trial, he himself was shot and killed by nightclub owner Jack Ruby on live television. Millions watched in disbelief. To calm public suspicion, President Lyndon B. Johnson established the Warren Commission to investigate. In 1964, the commission concluded that Oswald acted entirely alone. No conspiracy, no second gunman. But not everyone was convinced. In fact, from the very beginning, Americans questioned the story. Why did witnesses report hearing shots from different directions? Why did Oswald say, "I'm just a patsy," before his death? And why was so much evidence sealed away from the public? Let's start with the most infamous piece of evidence, the so-called magic bullet. The Warren Commission argued that one bullet hit President Kennedy in the back, exited through his throat, then went on to strike Governor Connally, breaking a rib, shattering a wrist, and lodging in his thigh. Yet somehow this bullet was later found on a stretcher in pristine condition. Critics ask, how could a single bullet cause so much damage and emerge nearly untouched? Ballistics experts say it defies logic. Then there's the Zapruder film, the home movie captured by Abraham Zapruder that shows the assassination in shocking detail. When Kennedy is struck in the head, his body moves sharply backward, suggesting a shot from the front, not behind. Dozens of witnesses reported hearing gunfire from the grassy knoll, a small hill in front of the motorcade. Some even claimed they saw smoke rising from that area. Yet the Warren Commission dismissed nearly all of those testimonies. And then, the autopsy. Doctors at Parkland Hospital described a wound in Kennedy's throat as an entry wound, but the official autopsy report later claimed it was an exit wound. Why the contradiction? Even more suspicious, the autopsy photos and x-rays remain controversial to this day. If Oswald wasn't acting alone, who else might have wanted Kennedy dead? First, the CIA. Kennedy had clashed with the agency over failed operations, like the Bay of Pigs invasion, and he openly spoke about dismantling the CIA's power. Could rogue elements have acted against him? Second, the Mafia. Kennedy's brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was aggressively prosecuting organized crime. Mob bosses had motive, and Jack Ruby, the man who silenced Oswald, had known ties to organized crime. Third, the military-industrial complex. Kennedy wanted to reduce America's involvement in Vietnam. He even considered withdrawing U.S. troops. Some argue that powerful figures in Washington and defense industries saw him as a threat to their interests. And finally, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson. Kennedy was rumored to be considering replacing him on the 1964 ticket. Johnson, who suddenly became president after JFK's death, had both motive and political gain. Why were so many people connected to the assassination silenced? Lee Harvey Oswald never got his day in court. Jack Ruby shot him just 2 days after his arrest, ensuring that the world would never hear his full testimony. Ruby later said he did it to spare Jacqueline Kennedy from a painful trial, but few believe that explanation. Even stranger, many witnesses who claimed to have seen or heard things inconsistent with the official story later died under unusual circumstances. Some were killed in accidents, others in violent attacks. Researchers have long noted the suspicious number of deaths among those linked to the case. The message seemed clear. Those who knew too much would not live to tell their story. In the 1990s, the U.S. Congress passed the JFK Records Act, demanding that all government files on the assassination be released within 25 years. Yet when the deadline arrived in 2017, many documents were still withheld. Even today, key files remain classified. What could possibly be so dangerous that the government still refuses to release it? If the official story were true, that Oswald acted alone, why hide anything at all? The secrecy only fuels suspicion that the American people have been denied the full truth. More than 60 years later, the assassination of John F. Kennedy remains one of history's greatest mysteries. Was it truly the act of a lone gunman, or was it a carefully orchestrated conspiracy to silence a president who challenged the most powerful forces in America? Perhaps we may never know the full truth. But one thing is certain, the unanswered questions still haunt the nation. And until every file is opened, America's greatest wound remains unhealed. If you believe history should never be hidden, make sure to subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering the secrets they never wanted you to know. Together, we keep the truth alive.